You may have heard the electric scooters in downtown Grand Rapids are going to be around for a while. So before you hop on that Lime scooter, that electric scooter, you may want to review the basic laws regarding this new way of getting around. And to do that, we turn to Tom Sinus from Sinus Dramus Law Firm. Hi, Tom.
Hi, Todd.
So how are electric scooters regulated in Michigan?
It's a really good question. And there's some funny words here. We actually have a state statute that regulates what you and I would call electric scooters, but under the state statute, we call them electric skateboards. I'm not exactly sure why, but if you look at the definition of what is an electric skateboard, it would include the kind of things that you and I know to be an electric scooter. And that's not just so much a legal curiosity. It's important because when we have state law that governs a particular form of conduct, so here riding a scooter, that of course obligates everyone to follow the law. And if someone is violating the law, creates a whole set of potential consequences. So we have a state law that gives us some basic safety rules, but we also have in that state law a specific direction that municipalities can enact their own ordinances about when these things, for example, can be ridden on the sidewalk. So the state law is authorizing the municipalities to have their own ordinances as well. And that's not always the case. Sometimes we have state law that says this is the only place you can look. So when it comes to a scooter, the short answer to your question is we have state law and we have local ordinances that anybody riding one of these things should be aware of.
Well, you mentioned the state law having some basic safety rules. What are those rules?
Okay, well, there's a number of them, but I'll rattle off a few of them. The scooter needs to be ridden as close to the right side of the roadway as practicable. People cannot ride more than two abreast, meaning side by side. Riders cannot pass other vehicles between lanes of traffic. And here's another interesting one. The statute actually says that people who are operating these scooters must exercise due care when passing a standing vehicle or a vehicle proceeding in the other direction. And then there's a specific rule about pedestrians. And it says that if you're on one of these things, you have to give pedestrians the right of way, and you have to give an audible signal before overtaking and passing the pedestrian. There are some other rules, Todd, about speed limits, for example. They can't operate higher than a certain speed limit, but most of the ones that people are renting are designed to not go faster than that. And there are other rules, and we have some resources on our website, but those I think are some of the most common ones that riders might be interested in.
Excellent information. Of course, we're going to want to dive deep into this if these scooters are going to be around a while. Now, when it comes to maybe an accident happening, maybe something with an injury, what about these no-fault benefits, the auto no-fault benefits? Did they apply here?
Well, that's a great question. The classic lawyer answer is it depends. If you are operating a scooter and you are injured, or if you're walking down the street and you are injured by a scooter, in those two scenarios, we don't have involvement of a motor vehicle, is the lawyer term, which just means involvement of what people would think of as a car. And if there's no involvement of a car, then the injured person cannot recover auto no-fault benefits, because that is the key gateway to receiving those benefits. Now, of course, on the opposite side, if someone is driving one of these scooters and they are hit by a car, regardless of who is at fault, then at that case, you do have the involvement of a motor vehicle, and the scooter driver would be entitled to receive auto no-fault benefits. So that's the no-fault piece. You have to have a car, and these scooters are not cars. However, that doesn't mean that we don't care about other people who are injured, of course, and it also doesn't mean that we don't care who was at fault. People who operate these scooters, even if they're just renting them, have to remember that they have the obligation to exercise basic safety when driving one of these. And if the person driving the scooter, was to injure a pedestrian, for example, then the person operating the scooter could be liable in what we call an action for negligence, for carelessness, regardless of no-fault benefits. Similarly, people who are injured on scooters by another vehicle, while they may have auto no-fault benefits, they may also have a claim against the person who caused the crash. So there's a variety, of course, of circumstances where people could be hurt on these things, and the rights and benefits that the victim has that they may have against the person who caused the incident. Those, of course, depend on how the crash happened.
There is a lot to unpack there, and these scooters are going to be around for a while. So if people want to get more information, you mentioned a resource.
Sure, they can find us online at www.sinusdramus.com. They can shoot us an email at info@sinusdramus.com, or they can give us a call in West Michigan at 616-301-3333.